So let me kick things off formally. Most of you have met me at this point. Matt Lanzini, the chairman of the Cesar Rodney Institute. Appreciate everyone joining us again here on our Tuesday afternoon chats. I have with me today Mr. Michael Maibach, and Michael and I were having a conversation earlier that he may be one of the few people on the planet that has more degrees and accreditations to his name than I do. A very learned individual. Michael spent, was it 18 years with Intel, running and kind of building out their global government affairs organization, and is now spending his time, because he can't sit still and just sit passively, so he's now spending his time working with Save Our States. And Michael, I want to thank you for joining us, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about what Save Our States is.
Well, thank you very much. Save Our States is headquartered in Oklahoma City. It was started in 2009 by Trent England, who is still the director of Save Our States. And we have one mission, and that is to defend the Electoral College without fear or favor. And so that's what we do. There's about 7 of us on the team. And we have a speakers bureau. Our website has lots of readings. And if a person wants to have a speaker in any state, we have designated speakers in 24 states, but we will travel to just about any U.S. state to speak on this topic or debate this topic.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I know there has been a lot of debate about this topic, and you offered to talk to us a little bit about why this particular topic is so important to small states, a state like Delaware, and kind of the background, history, purpose, and importance of the Electoral College in that context. So I know, Michael, you have some content, and you're going to walk us through, and we'll hopefully have some questions at the end that we'll take and ferret out to you.
Okay, we'll do this for about 25 minutes, and we'll hopefully have about 25 minutes for questions, something like that.
Great.
And I certainly am willing to stay on if there's people that want to stay on. We want to focus primarily on why the Electoral College was created within the Constitutional Convention. It's a very unusual approach, but it has been very successful for our country over 233 years now. Specifically, we want to look at some things having to do with the state of Delaware, because that's where Cesar Rodney Institute is, where I'm honored to be on your advisory board. The first question I'd like to ask people is, the European Union has 28 countries, all of which are democratic republics. We know them all, or most of them. And the question is, of the 28, how many have a direct election of their head of government, which is typically called the prime minister. I think in Italy it's called the president. There may be a few exceptions, but talking about direct election of their head of government. And here they are. This is a European Union heads of government at a meeting they had, and they took a large picture. And the answer is that only 2 countries of the 28 have direct elections, Cyprus and France. All the rest elect their head of government by the parliament. The prime minister serves at the pleasure of the parliament. So for example, in Germany, this is the Electoral College of Germany. Mrs. Merkel is from East Germany, the old East Germany, and she has never been on the ballot in all of Germany, only in her own constituency. And then this body actually chooses their chancellor. She's been the chancellor on 3 terms for about 10 years. So in the summer of 1787, at the Constitutional Convention, we had virtually no models other than the British model to look at. We had the failed Athenian democracy, and we had the failed Roman Republic after many hundreds of years, actually. But only the British had a democracy of any style other than Iceland in the whole planet at the time. In the Constitutional Convention, we had 55 delegates from 13 states, although I must stipulate, Rhode Island never sent delegates. They were invited, did not send anybody. So it was a convention actually of 12. Rhode Island eventually then approved the Constitution, but they didn't send anybody. But my point here is that the delegates came from the states. To understand the American Constitution in our republic, you have to put great weight on the states. Delaware had 5 delegates, and these are listed here. We don't have time to go through this, but these are very impressive men. George Reed, for example, signed the Declaration of Independence, as did James Wilson from Philadelphia, who I'm going to talk about in a minute. He was one of only 5 people that signed the Declaration and the Constitution. This is a Delawarean. He was in the Continental Congress. He was president of Delaware when they had a president. He was in the U.S. Senate, elected by the legislature in Delaware, and then he was the Chief Justice of the Delaware Supreme Court. So these were the best people in Delaware that were sent. And they were sent to find a balance between the large and state regions' interests. Virginia was the largest state in population, over 700,000 people in Virginia. Delaware was the smallest with 59,000. So Virginia had over 10 times as many people. So you can imagine if someone would have said, which they did at the Constitutional Convention, maybe we'll have a popular vote, the answer was, heck no, it'll always be from Virginia, or maybe Pennsylvania, New York, or Boston. That's where most of the people were. Philadelphia was the largest city. Boston, Baltimore, and New York were the other large cities. To give you a sense of the large state, small state dichotomy, this is Gunning Bedford, a delegate from Delaware, and that's why I bring him up here. He said in June 30th, this was just before the Connecticut Compromise, when they were arguing about the Congress and should it be by popular vote or everybody has an equal vote in the Congress, all the states being equal. He said, "I do not, gentlemen, trust you. If you possess the power, the abuse of it could not be checked. And what then would prevent you from exercising it to our destruction? You gravely allege that there is no danger of combination and triumphantly ask, how could combinations be affected? The larger states, you say, all differ in productions and commerce, and experience shows that instead of combinations, they would be rivals and countered the views of one another. This is language calculated only to amuse us. Yes, sir, the larger states will be rivals, but not against each other. They will be rivals against the rest of the states." And there really were 3 or 4 large states, and the rest, the other 9, were small. When Madison arrived in Philadelphia, he wrote a friend, he got there before most of the delegates, and he said, "The central problem we are going to face is one of representation." The problem they had to solve is mostly large versus small states, how to represent people in those states and in those regions. But the large small state issue was the main issue. And by the way, just parenthetically, every state in 1787 had slaves, as did virtually every country in the world. All right, 3 or 4 million slaves in Latin America, for example. So there was everybody had slaves. That question comes up a lot. This was the only model they had, which is they have a king and they have a parliament over in England, and they did not want to have that model. They wanted to have no king and no parliament choosing their prime minister. They had 3 goals in the Constitutional Congress for the presidency himself. And number 1 was to avoid possible tyranny of majority by Congress. In other words, a lot of people did not want the Congress to appoint the president because then they would run the government and they could tell the president what to do or get a new president. Number 2, balance the small and large states as well as regional interests in the selection of the president. And that's where the Electoral College also comes in, and to create an independent, energetic president. Washington, when he was the head of the troops for 7.5 years, was really plagued by the fact that there was no strong head of the government to deal with. He had members of the Continental Congress, a very weak appointed president, and he really believed we had to lead a nation, especially when the Europeans were going to try all kinds of things to undermine the independence of North America and of the United States. We needed a strong leader, especially if we got into a war. You can't run a war by committee. You need a general. So there were 3 plans: the Virginia plan, the New Jersey plan, and then the Connecticut plan, which became the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise. Parenthetically, Hamilton had his own plan, which was pretty much let's do what the British do, but it was not taken very seriously other than by Mr. Hamilton. The Virginia plan provided for a House and Senate that then would appoint the president, and the House and Senate would be allocated in terms of seats by the population of the state. So of course, Virginia, the largest state, wanted to have a House and Senate of proportional representation by population. A small state at the time, your neighbor to Delaware, New Jersey plan by William Patterson, wanted to keep the Articles of Confederation. After all, that was the current governing model, and to have just one house of Congress that would appoint a council of presidents. So this would be 3 or 4 or 5 executives, so power would be dispersed. And of course, Washington and others thought, well, then you could never get a leader from a committee. And for about 2 months, they were in loggerheads and had great debates and arguments about this. Finally, a fellow named Roger Sherman came forth, an evangelical Christian from Connecticut, and he proposed that the people be represented in the US House by popular vote. So the more people you had, the more seats. But in the Senate, every state got 2 votes, whether you're Delaware or New York or Pennsylvania, et cetera. And that was the compromise between the large and small states. And that really allowed them to go forward to actually have a constitution. Without this, without the states having the equal voice in the Senate. And by the way, remember, the Senate approves treaties, approves the Supreme Court, tries and maybe convicts in impeachment trials. So the Senate, the states, really have a huge role in this government. During the last week of the convention, that's when they picked the Electoral College, but they had votes all during the summer about how to select the president. They had 1 vote on popular election. Only Pennsylvania voted for that. Everybody else thought that would be the large state control, even mob tyranny, because they feared the mob, that's for sure. Some thought, well, maybe we can elect by Congress, like the New Jersey plan, and that would be seen as the British model of legislative tyranny. And then some, like Hamilton, discussed, well, maybe the 13 governors could choose the president. But then, of course, that would be a cabal. They could all meet in one room, and my gosh, what would they plan with nobody around? James Wilson, who was on the first Supreme Court later, this wonderful man, came up with the idea of the Electoral College. It's a vote by the people, but the elections are in each state, and it's a weighted vote depending on how many seats in the Congress, including the 2 Senate seats. So the small states do get some advantage in this. So it was a popular vote, state compromise, and this is the one at the end of actually the last week of the convention that was adopted. And you can look at Federalist 68 and 70 by Hamilton, if you want to see the arguments for this. But in the end, this is our Electoral College. It's not the Congress. These are the 50 state capitals where every December every 4 years after the presidential election, electors who are elected by their fellow citizens. I've been elected to be an elector here in Virginia. For example, this December, they meet and they cast their votes depending on how the state votes. The Federalist Papers were written by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay in support of the Constitution. In Federalist 70, Hamilton talks about energy in the executive. Madison in Federalist 51 talks about a president should be armed with a veto to stop a tyrannical Congress. The founders were very worried about tyranny of legislative power because of the British Parliament, and because some states with state legislatures and very weak governors had become tyrannical of their people in certain ways. Federalist 68, Hamilton talks about we have to avoid cabal, intrigue, and corruption by having the Congress choose the president, for example, and to elect amid tumult and disorder, sort of like this month, right? Where the electors would be dispassionate and wouldn't be part of a crowd, but would be meeting in a small room in a state capitol to vote without the crowds influencing them. The last part of this talk, I want to talk about the fact that we are a nation of states in so many ways. The Declaration of Independence was adopted by 60 delegates from 13 states, and that's where they came from. The Constitution was written by 55 delegates from 13 states. And of course, the Constitution itself was adopted by the 13 states. The Congress is organized by states in the sense that senators and House members are elected by state. You have congressmen from Delaware, congressmen from New York. There's no national congressman. Constitutional amendments take 2/3 of the House and Senate, and 3/4 of the states. To amend this document, you have to have 3/4 of the 50 states today to amend. Governance, every state has a governor, a state legislature, and 50 flags. Electing a president, we use the Electoral College through 50 state votes. And if no one wins, by the way, people forget this one, the 270 electoral votes, and this has only happened once in the 1800 election, I think it was. The House elects the president, but every state delegation just gets one vote. So if they're tied and can't agree, then there's no vote at all for president in the House determining. So the states have a huge role. Now, I looked at the history from 1900 until today. We've had 30 elections for presidents. In all but 2 of those, the winner of the presidency won the majority of states. Only Kennedy and Carter only got 23, and Nixon and Ford, I think, got 27 states. But those are the only 2 times the states have not won. And in the last century, it's only in the 19th century, the 1800s, it's only happened twice that the winner did not get the majority of states. However, the 2016 election has made people very upset about the Electoral College, and they say it's undemocratic. And so let's look at some things that we think are sort of fair in life. In the World Series, after 7 games, is it the most runs scored by each team or the most games won? In the Super Bowl, is it the most touchdowns all year to get to the Super Bowl or the most games won? So if you think about the most states won, you start to think about the Electoral College. In the US House and Senate, the control is by not the national vote of let's say, Democrats running for the House of Representatives or for the US Senate, but who has the most seats. In other words, who won the most games, if you will, in each of the states. The Bill of Rights, I guess we believe in democracy, majority rule, but may majorities in the House and Senate establish a national church, limit political and religious speech, deny your right to petition your government, or deny your right to own a gun, or can the Congress decide to torture people who commit crimes? No, none of these things can be done by majority. So we have great curbs on majority power because the founders knew and they read their Plato, who reflected what happened in Athens, and that is pure democracies always become tyrannical. And that's from Plato's Republic. But still there's a movement now since actually Al Gore was defeated by 100 and some thousand votes by George W. Bush in 2000. And it's called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. And they want to have a popular vote nationally and really forget about the states and having a role in this, forget about the states. And for Delaware, of course, you don't want that to happen. Now, 17 states and the District of Columbia, including Delaware, have already passed this compact. And they have one thing in common. All these states that have passed this all have a single party rule at the time they passed it. In other words, the House, the Senate, and the governor are all one party, happens to be the Democratic Party. We haven't had any of this happen in states that are divided in government or have all Republican rule. So this is pretty much a project of at least one part of the Democratic Party. Now remember, Delaware is still a small state. It's not the smallest anymore. It used to be, but now it's number 6. But look at how big the other states are. These are huge states out west. Alaska, my gosh, Alaska is as big as Texas or bigger. And so Delaware stands out as a very small state with a very small population. Matter of fact, 9 states have 51% of the voters of our country, 9 states. So if you have a popular vote, where do you campaign? You campaign where the folks are, right? 10 of our largest cities this year are in 6 states. And you see them there: New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Arizona, Texas, and California. Sorry. Only 9 states have more people than Los Angeles County. In other words, Los Angeles, just the county, has more people than 41 of our states. And those are legal voters. 38 states have fewer people than New York City. Matter of fact, Nassau County, which is 1 out of 3 counties on Long Island, this is not a part of New York City. Nassau County has more people than 10 states, including Delaware. So the message that was received, in my view, to the people of Delaware from your governor and your legislature when they joined the National Popular Vote Compact was, no matter how Delawareans vote for president, New York, Illinois, Texas, Florida, and California will decide every US president forever. That's really the message. No getting around that message. Now here is a state senator in Delaware, is a Republican, Anthony Del Colo, who has written the following when he was asked why he voted for the NPV compact. You know, in the present day, these are direct quotes, there are very few things that small states are uniquely concerned about. And my comment would be, all states may share certain concerns, but all 50 states compete for funds and political attention, especially in presidential elections. Will New York look out for Delaware or even New Jersey next door? I wonder. He also said the real protection for small states is not from the presidency, but from the US Senate. The real advantage that our constitutional republic has for small states is representatives in representation in the US Senate. Well, answer me this. If you can get rid of the Electoral College because states aren't important anymore and we believe in raw democracy, then the next argument probably from those progressive or left voices will be the following. Why does Delaware have 2 senators with less than 1 million people and California has 2 senators with 40 million people? I'm sorry, that's unfair as well. We really need to change that part of the Constitution, and let's have the states vote on that as well in a compact. So when you start to go down this path, Delaware, and with your 2 senators that are equal in power to all the other states, that 45 of which are larger, you may at some point have that call into question. There are some constitutional issues with the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. Number 1 is, in Article 1 of the Constitution, it says states shall not have compacts with each other unless congressional approval is given, because the founders did not want 3 or 5 or 7 states to gang up on the rest or have trade agreements just among themselves, etc. And of course, the national popular vote doesn't meet that test. There are other constitutional issues here, but I won't take time at this point to go through them. The main one is the compact clause. There's also all kinds of problems with the national popular vote. First of all, the cities will rule. I think I've made that clear. Now, for example, in 2016, Mrs. Clinton won the state of Illinois. I grew up in Illinois. Illinois has 102 counties. Mrs. Clinton won 12 counties and she won the state. The other 90 counties voted for Mr. Trump. Now, if we're going to have that kind of power in one city, in one state, you can see what will happen across the whole nation. There'll be huge parts of the nation that'll just be ignored because Miami, Houston, Chicago, New York, LA, et cetera, have so much of the population. There's deep national alienation, even succession talks, if you get rid of the Electoral College, because we will have significant states say, you know, it just, no one will ever visit us again. We will never get the attention of Washington. All of the funding now will go to the big population centers, et cetera. You may have a state vote total boycotts. In the New Hampshire legislature, they entertained legislation, didn't pass this year. They entertained legislation that told the Secretary of State in the next presidential election, release the winners' totals, but not any of the other totals. And therefore, they can't aggregate the national vote because we as a state won't even play that game. And you're going to see states, small states, start to look at that as a counter to this, what I would say is an unconstitutional compact. If you have national elections, there's going to be a demand for control nationally of our elections, because right now, 25 states give driver's licenses to illegal immigrants. 20-some states require that you have to have a driver's license with a photo ID to vote. You have some states that have mail-in ballots, some states that have multiple weeks of pre-voting, and other states that don't, et cetera. There's such a hodgepodge of election laws that people will file litigation and say, we don't have equal protection of the law. My state rules are very different than yours. You get to vote by mail and I don't, and on and on and on. And so the federal government will just have to control 3,242 county elections. And you can imagine once they deliver the mail, how they will accomplish all of that. Election fraud incentives will skyrocket because right now, if there's a million illegals in California, and it's estimated it's more than that, right now it really doesn't matter because they are limited in their electoral votes. But once you have the loss of this and you have a national popular vote, this will be a real problem. Endless recounts. If you thought in 2000 the Florida recount was a nightmare, just think if we have a very close vote by 100,000 votes and both parties' lawyers demand a national recount, it's not even fathomable how you recount 110 million votes. My gosh, Florida couldn't do a few million. And well, the two-party system will collapse. We take it for granted, but we have the greatest political system in the world. The Israelis tried to elect a prime minister last September, and until a few weeks ago, they couldn't agree in the Knesset, which has 110 members, because they have 10 parties, and Netanyahu and no one else had a majority. And so it took them about 6 months to get a prime minister. Just think if we have national popular vote, we'll have the blue party, the green party, the Save the Whales party. We'll have every party you can think of, the Libertarian Party, on. And we'll have 10 parties in the Congress. How do you choose a Speaker of the House? We have the great luxury of having a two-party system, which is hugely stable for governance especially in these days, my gosh. And the gridlock would never end. And so in the end here, what Washington wrote to Lafayette was, it is the best constitution that can be obtained in this epoch. And Madison wrote in Federalist 37, I perceived a finger of the almighty hand at work in Philadelphia. And I think we really were fortunate to have such a wonderful constitution. And to pull the Electoral College out of the Constitution and what that would do to this nation of states would probably be the beginning of the unraveling of the entire system. With that, I'd be happy to handle questions if there are any, Matt.
Well, yes, we have a number. And first, I just want to say on behalf of everyone, thank you. It's a very informative discussion. And, I often tell folks, especially folks that criticize our constitutional structure and the Electoral College, that before you criticize it, you should first try to understand it, which I'm not sure many take the time to understand it and understand why it was put together. We do have a number of questions from folks here, so I'll just go through them in order. I believe the first was just a comment from Michael Goodman that in Italy, the post of president is typically considered primarily ceremonial. I don't know if that requires feedback there. Rob Whitmore had
so they do have a prime minister. I take his point. And Italy has averaged one prime minister per year since the Second World War.
Wow.
And their constitution, by the way, is about 100 years old. It's less than half of the age of our constitution. We have the oldest constitution on the planet.
Wow. Rob Whitmore had a question. He said, when you refer to states, I've heard it stated that when the Constitution was being crafted, that the states were still at that point not necessarily states, they were colonies. Is that an accurate statement?
Oh my gosh, no. We had a Continental Congress since 1776, and until we got the Constitution of 1789, we were governed as a nation. Matter of fact, Morocco during the closing days of the war with England was the first country in the world to recognize us as an independent country. Matter of fact, the Treaty of Paris was a treaty between the United States of America and the British Empire, or the British government. And so we signed it. Virtually the first treaty we signed was a peace treaty with the most powerful country in the world.
Interesting, interesting. Question from Michael Goodman. When did Delaware have a president and what were his duties?
So that's a good question that people can research. Here's my guess, but I didn't research it honestly, is that during the Articles of Confederation period, you probably had a legislature that called their governor the president because it was appointed by the legislature. In about half of the 13 states before the Constitution, the governors were appointed. They even had consuls. That's where the New Jersey plan comes from. And so my guess is the president was appointed by the legislature. And that was part of the majority tyranny problem, because then the legislature really was a majority rule body without any curbs, no vetoes, no Bill of Rights, etc.
Absolutely. Comment that only aware of one other country where the term Electoral College has been officially used. I believe this was in Portugal in 1965.
I don't know if they do. I'm pretty sure India has an electoral college, but I will look up. That's a good question. I will look up and see if Portugal has an electoral college. I'm sure it doesn't operate the way ours does, but it's an interesting point. But we, of course, invented the idea.
Okay. Rob Whitmore has a question about the Committee of 11 in terms of how they were forged and framed the Electoral College. So can you describe the timing and role of the Committee of 11 in terms of how they forged and framed the Electoral College?
It's a very good point. It sounds like he's been reading. Very good for you, Rob. Toward the end of the convention, in the closing days of August, there were some problems they hadn't resolved yet. And the election of the president was number one on the list, but there were others. And so it was agreed that a committee numbering 11, Ben Franklin, of course, was there. Ben Franklin was seen as the wise old man of the convention. Washington was the sort of dignified, he gave it legitimacy. There wouldn't have been a constitutional convention without Washington showing up in that chair right behind us. This is a photo of the room where the Constitution was written up in Philadelphia. You can visit it. The Committee of 11 then included James Wilson and others, and I'd have to see who else was on that. I know Franklin and Wilson were, and they're the ones that came up with the idea of the Electoral College. But Wilson had broached the idea in early June, I think June 1st or June 11th. Wilson had broached the idea of Electoral College, but what he had in mind was that there might be regions that had votes, or that the legislatures would get to cast votes. It was very unfinished thought process, but that they then said, let's have a popular vote and let's have it be weighted.
Interesting. So Bob Priptok is asking, what mechanism was used to determine the number of delegates? Was it based on population, quantity of representatives? Was there a formulaic thought process to it?
There was, but I'll have to reread that. I don't recall now. As I said, Delaware had 5. I think it was sort of 4 to 12 kind of a range. But I'd have to. I would imagine. I'll make a guess that it was a fairly narrow range, even though the populations differed in a large measure, because that's how you got states to even feel like they would have a voice.
So I think he reframed it actually to what determines the number of delegates, and I think he's referring to the delegates for the Electoral College.
Okay. The Electoral College is 2 senators plus House members.
And that's the House membership is based off of some population figure or a density function, or?
Yeah, so, this is what we call, every 10 years, the Constitution requires a census, so there could be reapportionment of the House, 435 members. So for example, the next census will probably remove a member from Illinois and New York, and probably Arizona and maybe Florida will get another congressman, however that's going to shake out. So I live in Virginia. We have 11 congressmen. We have 2 U.S. senators, so we have 13 electoral votes. You have, what, two congressmen in Delaware?
Just one.
Just one with 900,000. So that's a large congressional district.
Yeah.
So you just have 3 electoral votes. Virginia has 13. Virginia has the same number of people as New York City.
Okay. And that's not, I don't know if this is true. This is just an item that I read somewhere that the number of 435, it was kind of arbitrarily capped. Has there been discussion to modify that, given that the population of the United States has grown by so much and that the distribution is different now? No.
No, not in, I don't think in a serious way. Back once the nation reached, I think it was, maybe it was 46, 48 states, they decided to cap it.
Okay.
And I don't think that's ever going to change. Of course, if we added a state, then
we'd have to add
we'd
some
either
senators.
reapportion it, but there'd be 2 more senators. But I don't see us, in this climate, we're not going to agree on anything like adding states. I don't.
So a follow-up question on that. With the District of Columbia not officially being a state, how and why does it have representation at the federal level?
That was part of a compromise in the 1990s. They have a non-voting member. They have 1 member. It's the same with Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico has a congressman, and they get to vote on committees and sit on committees, but they have no vote on the House floor.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, because they're not a state. It was really a compromise, and I think it was part of maybe the 25th Amendment. I'll look it up.
Okay.
But of course, DC wants to be a state and have 2 senators, even though it's pretty much gets 1/3 of its money from the federal government and half of its property is the federal government, et cetera. By the way, it's the first man-made capital in the history of the world. The second was Canberra, and the third was Brasilia. So we have 3 capitals in the world that were green fields. There wasn't anything there, and a capital city was created. Only 3. We were the first one in 1800, and Washington was the only one never to serve in the White House.
And Washington is technically built on swampland, correct?
Parts of it. Parts of it.
So this is a good question, and I'm not quite sure how to frame it properly. But essentially comes down to Delaware is a tiny state. How much more or less does my vote count in a presidential election compared to other citizens in other states that may be larger or smaller?
Yeah. One of the things that people criticize the Electoral College for is they say, in every one of these states, because it's winner take all, we use the British approach, first past the post, sometimes called winner take all system, which is the only system that allows true governance. If you have proportional representation, it's a disaster across Europe when they have this, because no one can ever have a working majority. But we have a majority rule. But because of that, if Delaware, the majority of the people vote for, let's say, Mrs. Clinton, whoever voted for Mr. Trump, their votes, they're counted in the state of Delaware, but not nationally. Mm-hmm. Well, if you had a national popular vote, then whoever was in the minority there, their votes wouldn't be counted. So it's kind of an empty argument in the sense that every election has people whose votes don't win. That's what we call elections, right? So by definition, elections have voters whose vote make a difference because they are on the majority side and those that don't. The question is, do you want to have 50 sets of those, or do you want to have just one big set of those? Yeah. But you're always going to have winners and losers. It's life is unfair in so many ways.
So this is a question I'm just thinking of the top of my head, and something maybe just to think about. If I'm not mistaken, it was probably like the 1913 or something like that. I think the 17th Amendment modified how federal representation was elected. It went away from being kind of the state senates essentially conglomerating and deciding who would be sent to the capital, and it moved to a direct popular vote of those individuals.
Yeah, right.
And I guess my question ultimately comes to, could that be used as a legal precedent in the future to shift towards this NPV?
Well, they amended the Constitution. This is
That's
part
true.
of the progressive platform. The referendum, recall, and initiative were all part of this as well. This is Hiram Johnson in California. This is Bob La Follette in Wisconsin. This is Woodrow Wilson. These folks wanted to have direct democracy, and they probably wanted to get rid of the Electoral College as well. But the popular election of senators came out of that period. It used to be that, remember when Abraham Lincoln ran against Stephen Douglas in 1858 in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which is where Lincoln really made his name and allowed him to become a presidential candidate of that stature 2 years later because of his debate performance, because he was so brilliant, frankly, in discussing the problem of slavery and the problem of the country. But Lincoln did not win that Senate race because the legislature of Illinois was a Democratic legislature and they elected Stephen Douglas, right? So it had nothing to do with the popular vote. He's out there giving these debates and people are getting a sense of the man, and their elected House and Senate members in Illinois were paying attention, and I'm sure attending these debates. There was no television, and so this was the only way to get your eye. That's why they had, I believe, it was either 9 or 11 debates around the state, including my hometown of Peoria, Illinois, had a debate site for Lincoln and Douglas. But that's, we now have the direct election of senators, but still 2 senators per state.
Right.
Yeah.
So a bit of a comment and then a question. So, if I'm not mistaken, Delaware actually, joined the pact last year or the year before. I don't remember.
2019.
Okay. Which legislature?
June.
So Delaware is now part of that, and I guess as citizens of the state, what can we do, or what can individuals do to voice our concerns about this initiative now that we're already part of the pact?
Well, I'll give you an example. Colorado's legislature and governor did join the National Popular Vote Compact. I think it was in 2018, and citizens organized and they put the issue on the ballot because in the state of Colorado, there is a referendum provision, like in California and a few other states, which they can change the decision of the legislature and the governor with a vote of the citizens. This is what Prop 13 was in California. Well, it used to be a famous thing. And so this November 3rd, the people of Colorado are voting yes or no, do we want to be part of the National Popular Vote Compact? I hope it is. And by the way, 90-some% of the money going into Colorado and advertisement to be for staying in the compact is coming from California.
Wow, wow.
All the money supporting the National Popular Vote Compact come from New York City and California.
Which goes back to one of your early slides, specifically stating that the large states want to have excess influence. And
there's another quote from our Gunny in Bedford of Delaware. The small states would find some foreign ally of more honor and good faith who will take them by the hand and do them justice. He was threatening the other states. If you mess with us here in the Constitutional Convention, we'll speak with European countries about having alliances with them. This was his threat.
Yeah.
On the floor of that room right behind me there. So your guy, Gunny in Bedford, really was a small state guy. And I think you should have a Bedford movement in Delaware, which calls for the change. But I don't think you have referendum in Delaware. And if you don't, you'll have to petition your state legislature to change their mind.
Yeah.
That's a tough thing to do. You got to probably change the members
of the legislative body. Yeah.
Because that's the only recourse. That's why this is a tough thing once the legislature. But by the way, it doesn't go into effect. It sits there. until they have in the compact 270 electoral votes.
Yeah.
And then it automatically goes into effect, which will then trigger a Supreme Court crisis, because this will be adjudicated by attorneys in every state, probably, or many states. And the Supreme Court will have to decide, is this even constitutional? Because it's a compact. Even if the Congress says it was, approved this compact, I don't know if you can change the Constitution through a state-by-state compact. That, remember, there's only two ways to change the Constitution in the Constitution. One is 2/3 of the Congress, House and Senate, 3/4 of the states, or the states can call a constitutional convention.
Right.
And then 3/4 have to adopt whatever they come up with, and they can get around the Congress. But neither of those things is happening with this. This is really making a lot of lobbyists wealthy and spending a lot of time we don't want to spend defending the Constitution. But we are educating people about the Electoral College and the importance to states like Delaware.
Maybe that's an ancillary benefit. Michael, any other comments? I don't know if we have any other questions from folks here. Let me just make sure I didn't miss anything. I don't think so. No.
I just put up a picture since 1980, how many states the winner won, and Reagan won 44 and 49. So you can see that even Bush v. Gore, which was only, the difference was only about 200,000 or 300,000 vote difference.
Yeah.
It was very, very close out of 100 million cast. So it was what, 3%. But Bush won 30 and Gore won 20 states. And then of course with Trump, that was a bigger difference, and we can talk about that, but he won 30 states again versus Clinton's. And of course he got 2,600 and some counties, and she won 400 and some counties. So,
right, well, I mean, her campaign strategy was essentially focusing on those pockets of dense population and ignoring the rest of the country.
New York, California, a few other big states. And he had an Electoral College strategy.
Yeah.
She had a popular vote strategy. And if they do it again, I'm sure they would do it completely differently. But that's, you don't get do-overs.
Everybody was playing by the same rules, right?
That's right.
So Michael, I sincerely appreciate the conversation, and I think education's critical. And quite frankly, I don't think most people really understand the Electoral College or the history and background or why it was constructed and the measures it put in place to protect us from one-sided or tyrannical rule. So I sincerely appreciate that. I'd just like to remind our attendees that we have our discussion next week. Next week's discussion will actually be on Thursday. We'll do that on Thursday, July 2nd. And Bill will send an update out. I believe we have some of our local state legislators joining us, and we'll talk a little bit about current happenings down in Dover in Legislative Hall. Again, Michael, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it as always, and hope you're doing well.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks, Bill. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody, for dialing in.
Take care, folks.
Bye-bye.